Welcome, everybody, to the People Prescription, the right dose of HR wisdom. Today, we've got psychotherapist Sarah Toombs with us on our second episode. And today, we're talking about psychology in the workplace and specifically signs of burnout and the real cost of always being on within the workplace. So great to have you with us today, Sarah.
Oh, thank you, Rich, for having me. I loved part one, so I'm excited for part two.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's going to be great to do a bit of a deep dive in terms of how we can engage with teams if they're experiencing burnout, what leadership teams can actually consider as part of a good well-being package, and the kind of methods that you'd recommend from a psychotherapist perspective in terms of how to build a healthy culture and, more importantly, a healthy workforce.
Yes. So important when you think about that, building a healthy workforce, because healthy, happy staff gives a healthy, happy workforce. So yeah, let's get into that.
100%. So I suppose a good place to start would be a lot of the time when I speak to business owners, they explain that there's sometimes challenges around measuring somebody's capacity for work or compared to what their output looks like. And what I always suggest to them initially is to listen to their team, because ultimately the businesses that run the most efficiently and effectively, the leadership team gets to know the team very well. So if you've got like a line manager with a direct report, the best advice I would give to any manager would be to get to know their team. I think the challenge when it comes to burnout is that it doesn't always start with a collapse of somebody, or it starts with silence. So what I always try and promote and encourage business leaders to do is to try and establish a communication, a conversation with the team to measure how they're feeling, and if there is any risk of burnout, or if there is any risk of perhaps them reaching breaking point before it becomes a problem. And I've shared examples of this in the past with other people, but you and I had a conversation before about an estate agent that I was speaking to, and essentially that estate agent was in a position where they were incredibly busy doing the work and on the tools, getting involved in viewings and sales and negotiations. And the team, because of the amount of volume of the work that they were getting through, was clearly on the brink of not collapse, but they were certainly feeling burnt out. So that person was in a position, not through any malice or anything like that. They were just very, very busy doing what they do, and they'd not perhaps spotted some of the signs of burnout. And we had a conversation about what to look out for if certain things manifest within the team. And it'd be good to get your opinion on this in terms of what employers can do to help their employees and their teams to thrive in an environment which sometimes actually gets very busy. Do you find that sometimes, Sarah, within your role, that perhaps people aren't as keen to open up about that there's a bit more silence around what they're capable of or what they're prepared to do in the workplace?
Thank you for all of that. There was a couple of things going through my head when you were speaking.
Yeah.
So I can hear something about burnout and how that starts with silence. So I can hear something about burnout and stress, and maybe we can explore that in a bit more detail. And then something about the signs to look out for when people are stressed. So people listening can think, okay, I can see this. What do I need to do? And then there's that other piece there about being honest, and being honest in the workplace about what we are capable of, being honest if we're struggling, and how do organizations and cultures foster a culture where people can be honest and say, this is what's happening, and then do the leaders know how to support their staff? So I feel like there's a couple of things that we could pick up on there.
Well, let's start where we were talking about the burnout side of things and what people can do.
Yeah. So when we think about burnout, then we need to touch base and start thinking about stress so we can get a sense of kind of what that is. So stress is kind of the body's natural response to pressure. So in the short term, this can be really good, helps us kind of meet deadlines, solve problems. And when we think about that, it can be really beneficial because it helps us rise to challenges. So one of the key things to think about is not all stress is bad. Sometimes stress can be positive, and I'm doing that because there's no such thing as positive stress. It's actually called eustress. So
Right.
this is the type of stress where people feel motivated, they can get things done, they rise to those challenges, but then afterwards there's periods of rest and recovery when that pressure isn't as high. So really worth bringing this into the conversation, because if there's stress in the workplace, which there always is. We can't avoid that. It's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily a bad thing if people feel like they can cope with that. But where we have to give attention to is with burnout. Burnout happens when that stress becomes chronic, like there's no respite from the pressure. People feel overwhelmed. It's kind of like that emotional, physical, mental exhaustion. And then it often leads to ill health for that individual. So, really, really serious that we take this seriously and think about being proactive. And then we can think about this in a bit more detail using the demand control model, if we can
Right.
bring that into the conversation.
Yeah, but what's that? What's the demand control model?
Yes. So if we look at it in a bit more detail, it was developed by Robert Karasek, and we can use this with organizations and teams to explain why some high pressure roles lead to burnout while others don't.
Mm-hmm.
So, jobs with high demands, things like tight deadlines, heavy workloads, but where there's little control, where people feel like they're being micromanaged, they've got no autonomy, they've got kind of little decision making power, these are the most stressful. And we have to think about, is this then going to lead to burnout? So, this is high demands, but little control. That's what the individual feels.
And do
But
you
then,
notice a pattern, Sarah, around like the type of work that people that fall within this kind of category? Do you notice if there's case studies about it, are the same type of roles referred to, or could it be any sector, any role?
yeah, I think so. I think it could be any sector, any role,
Right.
because, it doesn't matter what kind of the type of work that it is we're doing. What's most important is kind of, does that individual feel like they've got control over that? So I think
Right.
this really applies to any sector, any workplace, taking
Excellent.
into account kind of that pressure that people are under, and do they feel like they've got control over that? I guess if we put this into perspective for a moment, so people could recognize this with their teams, we might have two employees in the same workplace, so one could manage their own schedule, take
Right.
breaks, make their own decisions about how to complete tasks. They feel clear to make those decisions, and they feel supported by the management to make those decisions. They will be able to manage that pressure. So the demands will be high, but so will their level of control. So in the
Mhm.
short term, they'll be able to manage that. In the long term, that's probably not sustainable because as humans, we're not designed to operate at that high level of stress. But then if we circle back and we think about the other, whether this is another workplace or the same workplace but another team member, if that individual has no flexibility, they're being kind of micromanaged, they've got unrealistic expectations. So basically, what we're saying there, relating back to this model, is the demands are high, but that person's level of control is low. Which one's more likely to burn out? Well, it's that one with very little control.
It's a
Yeah.
good litmus test then from what you shared there. So for any listener that's running a company or running a department, these are the kind of things to look out for in terms of assessing, like a bit of a testing the temperature of the team and risk assessing a team. These are the kind of areas to look out for. So you can perhaps focus your
Mhm.
attention on those areas first and prioritize those type of roles before others. So I think that's incredibly helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I would say use this with your team. Sit down kind of with your teams, bring it into kind of a team session, sit down kind of with your leadership team and think about, where would we say the team is?
Right.
Also have the conversation with your employees. Where do they think they are in this model? And then having those conversations about what would they need to support their level of control. Because I think it's really important that we ask the people, we don't just assume. We ask the people, do they think they've got high control in this situation? And if
Mm.
not, what can you do as a workplace to support their kind of level of control so they can feel like they can do the job? They can rise to the challenge, they can manage the demands. Don't just kind of assume. I think that's really important.
I couldn't agree more, Sarah. I think from a very practical point of view, if people are making decisions in the leadership team, typically key thing that they're looking for is data. So they want to understand and verify what's occurring within the business before they make a decision. I couldn't agree more. I think assumptions are incredibly dangerous things to be avoided at all costs when it comes to running a company or running a business. So from a practical perspective then, once we've established and verified perhaps there is a risk of it occurring within the workplace, what are the next steps from there?
Yes, well, really great question. It makes me think about what organizations can actually do to think about creating more of a resilient team, because everybody listening to this will want resilient, high-performing teams, and we have to start making well-being a priority. So there's a framework that I would love to bring into the conversation called the LEAD framework, if we can
Right.
talk about that for a moment, to give
Yes, yeah,
people
100%. It's called LEAD, LEAD.
Yes, LEAD framework. So it stands for leadership, education, alignment, and then design.
Right.
So the first thing that teams, organizations can think about is leadership. So when we're wanting to create resilient teams that don't burn out,
Hmm.
this is what we want to do. So thinking about leaders taking that proactive role to break unhealthy work habits. So, lots of times we can see those unhealthy work habits in organizations where people overwork, take on more workload. You know, we were having a conversation before about the pandemic and
Hmm.
working from home, and sometimes those boundaries can get super blurred, can't they? Where work
Absolutely.
goes into home, home goes into work, and that ultimately can lead into burnout. So, leaders have that responsibility to break those unhealthy work habits and model that more healthy behavior. So, setting boundaries, taking breaks, being like a proactive advocate for workplace well-being, and taking kind of mental well-being and making it normal. Just like we openly discuss physical health and we tell
Yeah.
people to take walks, you know, having those conversations in the workplace about mental well-being, making that normal. So ways proactively we can do that is checking in proactively with our people,
Hmm.
booking one-to-ones, making them non-negotiable. You know, the amount of times that they go into the diaries and then they're the first thing to get pushed out when deadlines are high. Like,
Right.
let's not make that happen. Let's make them non-negotiable and actually check in with people. So thinking about, we talked a little bit about this in podcast one, like the first chat we had the other week, where we
Yes.
were
Yeah.
thinking about communication styles,
Hmm.
um, learning about what people are not saying, because we say such a lot with our body language, don't we? So actually checking in properly and asking people, what do they need? How are they? And having those proactive conversations. So that's the first part. I don't
Right.
know what your thoughts are about that, first of all.
Yeah, I think ultimately, from a people operation perspective, the one thing that I do encourage people and companies to consider is surveying the team regularly, asking questions, thoughtful questions about how organization structure can be improved, what challenges that organizations and the people teams are facing. And genuinely, those surveys are a fantastic way to build engagement because it shows interest in what the team's thoughts are on a given challenge, perhaps that they're facing, or how things can be improved further as well. So, yeah, ultimately, from a HR perspective, asking the right questions, giving people the opportunity, like you're saying, one to ones, incredibly important. Communication is probably, if there are challenges within organizations, a lot of it can actually, when you boil down to, okay, well, what's the real problem occurring within this company? It can stem from communication levels needing to be
Yes.
developed. And yeah, 100%, I can see how HR can actually help organizations to achieve some of those criteria that you were mentioning earlier within that framework. So, what
Yeah.
would be the next step then of this framework?
Yeah, the next step actually leads on really well to what you were talking about then, which is a bit about that communication, but we're talking
Right.
about education. So the second part is education. So this is kind of building awareness with your team and upskilling them. But the first part I want to invite us to think about is training the leaders to hold those one-to-ones. So
Right.
linking back to what you were saying then about communication,
Mm-hmm.
in my experience, lots of people want to have the conversations, they care deeply, but they just don't know how to have conversations about well-being. They fear that they'll say the wrong thing, so they don't say anything at all. There's this kind of culture as well about be strong and not show emotions, when we know that that is something that we need to proactively challenge and change. So really kind of educating, first of all, managers and leaders on how to navigate wellbeing conversations, what language to use, what to say, what not to say, and I guess providing training so leaders feel confident and competent, first of all.
And
Yeah.
in terms of building that confidence, are there areas that you'd suggest that they focus on as far as just building up a bit of a habit around being comfortable, or perhaps even like a way to establish a good connection with a team member that's professional, that isn't, prying too much into their personal life, or something that's quite user friendly that people can use and leaders can use to approach the subject of well-being?
Yes. A couple of things go through my mind. First of all, I think being open. So circling back to step one of this framework, which was the leadership piece, leading by example. The research says that the more likely other people are to open up to us is
Mhm,
if we've opened up to them. We don't have to share lots and lots of personal things. We're not talking about that. We're
mhm.
continuing to keep boundaries. But if we can
Yeah.
share a little bit and lean in and say something about how we've been feeling, one thing we do for our mental well-being, more likely the person that you're in conversation with will also lean into that. So I
Right.
think being open, leading, taking that kind of ownership of the conversation, that would be an absolute thing I would say to do.
Excellent. No, that's a fantastic
Mm,
tip. One thing I do see from a HR perspective is questions from leaders around if somebody's taking time off, occasionally dependent on what an organization's sick pay policy would look like. They have challenges where people actually attend work and perhaps they're clocked in to work, but they're not necessarily mentally there, and or they don't have the headspace. The headspace is long gone for the work. And that presenteeism can sometimes create challenges for business owners because they've got essentially a workforce that's in work, but isn't actually fit to work. So
yeah.
these tips and handy hints that you're sharing today, I think would be incredibly useful to establish, is that happening within the workforce as well? Have you got people who are checked in for work who've turned up but aren't actually there in mindset from a performance perspective? How that can manifest itself, presenteeism, a huge issue, as is absenteeism as well. And a lot of what you're sharing here from a HR point of view, it really, to sing the praises of making sure that we're looking after team well-being. There is a pounds and pence reason for that, folks, and it is around reducing sickness absence within the workplace. Costs a huge amount of money in the economy each year in terms of people taking time off if they're unwell. So if there's measures that employers can do, that companies can do to avoid those situations happening, I'm a huge fan of prevention's better than cure. So these
Mm,
topics that we're talking about today, this framework, I think would be a fantastic way to build what would be that, hopefully, a preventative approach.
yes. I was really listening to everything that you were saying then. And there was a couple of key things for me. There was something about how do we know if we don't ask the staff? So making
Mhm.
sure, guess circling back to that step one of the framework, checking in, asking, having the open conversations, and then continuing to build that preventative approach, which links back, if we circle back then to kind of this educate. The second part of the educate is providing training for your team. When I go into organizations and provide workplace well-being and stress management, I always ask the question, like, how many people here have actually done any kind of stress management training? And usually out of a room full of people, you get like one, two hands, when stress is a part of every job, every life experience.
Mhm.
Like we were saying before, we're all going to experience stress. So why aren't we being proactive about educating people on how to manage it, what's happening, what they can do? So take that proactive, preventative approach and educate your team, make well-being essential. That's
Yeah.
absolutely something I would say.
No, I agree fully. I think the challenge is for a lot of UK business owners that in the UK generally, there is this perception of, it's almost like a stiff upper lip, the keep calm and carry on approach, which I appreciate there are benefits to that. But if people are overplaying that hand, in my view, I've seen this a lot within leadership roles, it does eventually catch up with them. And I think
Yeah.
it's quite helpful actually to view it with a bit more perspective. Does that kind of approach have longevity? Perhaps not. No, it's something that eventually will catch up. And these methods that you're sharing today, Sarah, I would suggest that anybody listening to them, if you're an employer, to look at implementing them, even if it's not every department within your organization, but perhaps start with a department where you believe the individuals that work there are at higher risk of experiencing these kind of challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Look at what you think you can implement and take that proactive approach, thinking about what education do you think your staff need? So we're just
Hmm.
talking about education training for your leaders, but also stress management for your teams. But it
Hmm.
could be anything. We spent part one talking about overthinking.
Hmm.
Actually, is that something you notice within your team? And therefore, would it be helpful to have a workshop on managing overthinking designed for your business? So I
Hmm.
think it's asking the people and then taking that proactive approach on, okay, what can we provide then? Is it something around mindfulness? Is it something around, I guess, mental fitness? Is it
Hmm.
something around resiliency training? But actually thinking about how can you make these available for your people so
Yeah.
your, I guess, well-being's a priority in the workplace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I think of well-being, I also consider the resilience of an individual and of a team collectively. So,
Mm.
from a resilience perspective, what are the kind of activities that you'd recommend somebody to do that would build up that resilience? Is it purely lived experience that can help with resilience, or can you actually create an environment that, again, using the analogy of the muscle, and repeating, say, like a weight, is there something that people can do to create that sort of situation where they're lifting a weight, they're repeating it, and the muscle gets stronger? I mean, what would you suggest there?
Yes, lovely question. I've got a few thoughts on this. So resiliency, absolutely, linking back to what you first said, it's something that we can build, something that we can grow.
Hmm.
So really key to think we're not either resilient or not. Resiliency is something that we can grow. A bit like I use the analogy of an elastic band. We're designed to stretch, we're designed to expand. So we are resilient and we can grow resilience with a few key things. Lived experience, absolutely. So encouraging people to think about what have they survived, what have they overcome, maybe having conversations about that. Also thinking about linking this back to the workplace, if we were thinking from a workplace wellbeing perspective, thinking about does the team know kind of the culture, what you've survived as a business, kind of
Hmm.
getting people involved in that and thinking about what is the team's lived experience together, having open conversations or having someone hold those conversations for you and the team. Resiliency is also linked into that mindset, what
Right.
you were just saying, like that muscle. We can think about growing a resilience mindset. Have we got a growth mindset? And there's
Hmm.
things that we can do to think about growing that mindset. Challenging unhelpful thinking, absolutely, for me, comes into resiliency. We want to be able to grow that mindset, challenge
Hmm.
unhelpful thinking, build those reps in. So we're choosing what we think about, which
Right.
can create that more positive mindset. We're proactively discounting and challenging unhelpful thoughts so that
Right.
we can stay resilient, we can manage stress better. When people know their why, that can boost resiliency. So when we think about resiliency, do your people know their individual why? Like, why are we doing what we're doing? What is the purpose? Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we working for this company instead of, I don't know, for another one? So helping people tap into what is their reason, what is their why, maybe aligning that with the organizational values. So, what is the company's why? What's the business's why? And helping
Hmm.
people really understand that. So, when people have got a sense of their own individual why, and if they can hold on to that each day, people can find the strength, the drive to turn up and give the best. So, really knowing your why can absolutely link into that resilient mindset and resilient culture.
Right. So, I mean, I find a couple of things as you were sharing that there that I thought what I find a lot with businesses, especially if they're rapidly growing, is
Mm.
that there can be a disconnect as the growth starts becoming exponential between why and what the team are actually focused on, because essentially they're that busy delivering on outcomes that meet certain milestones of the business growth that it can actually become lost the reason why they do what they do. So that's great to hear that, that's something actually that would help people going through that what would be growth pains of growth within an organization to make it a bit more healthy and more measured and effective, really, for their teams. So, coming back to what you were saying about the framework, then, so we've covered half of the framework. So, what would
Yeah.
be the next step of the framework?
Yes, brilliant. So the last two pieces, so the first of the last two is alignment. So building trust, building autonomy, and that psychological safety. So linking back to that demand control model that we talked about at the beginning, aligning with your people, empowering them with flexibility, ownership of the work. This way, if you're going through a really busy period, like, we were talking about the tax year ends often really busy for teams, demands are high, but so is their level of control. People are more likely to manage that stress better, trusting people and giving them autonomy. So really kind of aligning with your people, trusting them, giving them autonomy. Also building that psychological safety, encouraging open conversations where people can share the struggles in those one-to-ones, not just making them about the job or the project that you're working on, having
Mm-hmm.
those check-ins so
Right.
people can share what's happening for them. And then recognizing effort and not exhaustion. So, really creating sustainable success in the business,
Yes.
resiliency, because we're talking about the effort that people are making. So, really kind of talking to that and actively aligning with your people by calling out what they've done well. I
Right.
don't know, often we don't do that, do we? In the UK, we don't do that as in conversations. Lots of
Yeah.
time, those conversations can be about what's gone wrong or where does
Mm-hmm.
someone need to improve. So, kind of recognizing the effort that's been made and aligning with that person and saying, okay, this has gone well. This is really good.
Mm-hmm.
Celebrating that success. I think that's key as well.
I mean, again, from a people ops perspective, I think that there is a huge power in recognition and showing people appreciation for the work that they do, not least because
Yes.
it's incredibly useful from a motivation perspective. If you've given somebody a huge task to complete, the climbing a mountain metaphorically, it's quite helpful for them to perhaps celebrate wins along the way where they've hit certain milestones of that journey, and that's what keeps people going and keeps people motivated. So to break down what would
Mm.
be, say, it's like a process within an organization, and find what would be good sweet spots to share the successes and the praise, that's a really useful way to keep people engaged in the work that they're completing, and more importantly, motivated. Motivation, I find, is something that can fleet one moment and the next
Mm.
minute you're full of motivation. But what I find is very helpful in these circumstances, it's similar to what you're sharing really here about the framework. Before we get into the last part of the framework, I think what's actually useful for this key thing I'm getting really from this conversation is the power of process. And if there is a process in place, then you can actually build it almost like a discipline behind it that allows people to maintain a consistent approach in how they're dealing with certain aspects of the business. Now, in this case, talking about well-being and people strategy, but we can use this sort of model to effectively find systems and processes within the organization to achieve other objectives as well. It's not necessarily, it could be well-being related, it could be something completely different. So I like that there's a framework, I like that there's a process that people can follow, and where there's the discipline behind it to actually follow up on those steps of the framework, then yeah, it builds that consistency, and more importantly, it makes it incredibly achievable as well, because
Yeah.
people get that, if you do this, this, and this, then at the end of it, we have a happy team. I like that. I like that consistency as well. So the
Yeah.
last part then, what's the last part of the framework?
Yeah. The D is design. So we
Mhm.
want to, right from the beginning, design a sustainable practice, design a
Right.
sustainable process.
Mhm.
But also to talk to that point before we get into it, it's never too late to design this into your workplace. Like we had a conversation before about someone you're supporting who'd grown rapidly. It's never too late to go back and think about designing well-being into your workplace. Yes,
Hmm.
it's incredible if you can do that from the beginning and give an eye to that, but you can do that at any point. So you can think about designing your workplace well-being so you can boost resilience and support your people. So I thought that was like really key to think about before we go into step 4, which is the design. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you say, you've got to be able to communicate that well within a team. And I'm sure you could enhance that picture for many businesses, Sarah, in terms of sharing your expertise in how to get people on the right track if they are time poor and they need somebody to do that for them. Is that something that you get involved in as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. If you're listening to this and you're thinking about what could you do for your people, I would love to create something bespoke, thinking about
Yeah.
what do your people need, what does your workplace need, and then what practices can we design to keep your people happy. So that's about design, thinking about what does your unique setting need,
Mhm.
thinking about kind of well-being in your workplace and not as a perk, but as a priority, thinking about supporting your staff, supporting your people,
Mhm.
providing access to support. So ensuring you've got access to support in the first place. You know, we were mentioning earlier on in our conversation about the education piece, which is the
Mhm.
workshops, the training, but also thinking about have you got access to stress coaching, counselling, and making sure that it's available to your people,
Mhm.
and then making sure that your managers, your leaders are proactively promoting this. So, linking back to what we were just saying, that daring to lead piece,
Mhm.
being proactive, promoting this, maybe even saying, like, yeah, I get stress coaching. So, it's normalized in the workplace and people want to manage the mental well-being. And then finally, thinking about working smarter and not longer,
Mhm.
encouraging kind of deep work, but making sure people have got recovery time, making sure people don't store up their annual leave and actually take it. You know, I find that a lot in the workplace where people kind of store up their annual leave or
Mhm.
they don't want to take time off because they think that if they do, you know, everything will crumble. But actually, we know that we need breaks. So making sure that you're encouraging people to take annual leave, you're setting realistic goals. So you're building your workforce on balance and so that people can be happy, healthy, people feel valued, and you're designing that right from the beginning with intention.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, again, drawing on my experience of I do this practice of time blocking in calendars. So essentially, I treat the calendar that I have as a to-do list, and that gives me an aspect of understanding as to what's involved in a given day. But also, I view it as setting myself up for the win in the sense that I know where I'll perhaps need a break. I appreciate that there's contextual challenges around the type of work that you do, but if the type of work that you do, if it's very much knowledge based, then you know, in my view, it's a lot more beneficial to focus on outcomes, not necessarily time as such. It's really useful to focus on, okay, if we're giving high performers within the team certain outcomes for them to achieve, as long as they're capable of achieving the outcomes and we've set them up for the win, they've got the right training in order to achieve those outcomes, then I think it can be very challenging where you're constantly measuring time on particular tasks, whereas actually what we should be measuring is the outcome that's been
Mm.
achieved. And as long as the outcome's been achieved to the standard that's required, in my view, the time issue really becomes it's not a priority because you're giving people, and again, that's where there's an aspect of empowerment to it as well. And there's an aspect of trust that if you say, if I'm a leader and I have a direct report, I'm not going to be as concerned about whether or not somebody's gone to pick the child up from school or if they've gone to, I don't know, run an errand or something like that. As long as the outcome's achieved, then how they spend their time doing it, I think it's important to have, of course, those boundaries in terms of when would be working time and when you don't have working time. But, coming back to that piece around using the calendar as a to-do list, if you're using time blocking as an example, then it allows people to have that visual of understanding as to, all right, okay, at that time of day, that's where I'm working on this. And it can be a lot less reactive and a bit more
Mhm.
proactive, really. So just spending a couple of half an hour the day before to say, right, next tomorrow, this is what I'll be doing, this is what I'm focused on. And there's also, from an engagement perspective, a useful aspect of that is knowing that you're making progress, that you did what you set out to do. So there's an aspect of when you do switch off, you can switch off fully. You don't have to worry about, oh, I
Mm.
didn't get the time to do that because you've already proactively included it in the diary in the first place. So Yeah, I can see how that would be valuable for somebody in a team.
Yeah, wow. So many key things in what you said there. I was really hearing that trust. Are we instilling trust into our people? Not micromanaging like we've talked in the beginning, and are we instilling that trust that the task in hand can get done? And as you were saying then, they've got the freedom, the flexibility to live life. I always say we can't separate who we are as people from who we are in the workplace. We just want us. So we will have children, dogs, relatives, all the things.
Yeah.
So actually making sure that people can bring the whole selves to the workplace and that you are instilling trust in your people. Yeah, really.
I mean, it's a key part of empowerment as well. Companies perhaps who are experiencing high attrition rates or they have quite a lot of short serving members of the team. Typically, what I'd be looking at there is to ask them, okay, well, why are people leaving in the first place? And once the problem is identified, 50% of the challenge is solved straight away because we know what's driving that challenge. But empowering the team, I find, is an incredibly valuable retention tool, and it's a great attraction tool as well if you're trying to attract great talent, people who you're engaging essentially because they know more than you do. That's the whole point, in my view, of engaging somebody. They're there to support the roles in a way that complements your skill set. I think that it's incredibly valuable to view it that way.
Yeah, agree.
Right, so we've covered quite a lot of ground already then, haven't we, in terms of, burnout, what the causes of that can be, and what measures people can take and businesses can take in order to support teams to sort of navigate what is a really tricky issue. What would be, from what you've seen in your practice, the hidden costs of burnout?
Yeah, lovely question, and one we really need to take
Hmm.
seriously. So, in order for us to kind of remember this, I want to share an acronym, which is COSTS.
Right.
So, the C is the first hidden cost of burnout on business, which is creativity suffers. So when we're stressed, we can't think in creative ways. And again, we kind of were thinking about overwhelm and overthinking and where that comes from in part one. Circling back to this topic around creativity, when we're burnt out or super stressed, we don't have that mental capacity or space for innovation, problem solving, strategic thinking, anything that's going to innovate or expand the business. People are in survival mode. So I think that's a really important aspect to think about, that innovation will suffer, expansion will suffer, because we can't problem solve, we can't be in creativity mode if we're in
Hmm.
burnout.
Understood.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the hidden costs, then, are you saying that it essentially, from a decision making perspective, if somebody's in that state of mind, they're not going to be as effective in making what would be good decisions? They need that opportunity to perhaps rest or reset.
Yes, absolutely. When people are in burnout or stress, those decisions can't be made, and that can contribute and lead into kind of that overthinking.
Hmm.
Often I describe it as people can just start spinning on a spot. They can't see the wood for the trees. So that can be a hidden cost of burnout on business. The next one is the O in cost. So that's overwhelm. Linking back to this demand control model that we said at the beginning, people can only sustain high stress and pressure for so long before they become overwhelmed. So if the demands are high and the control's high, that's great. But actually, we don't want the demands to be so high for so long that people then burn out, because then we've got this overwhelm. People can then, when they're overwhelmed, like disengage in what they're doing, which I guess if we look at it from kind of the business point of view, productivity is lost,
Hmm.
output is lost, and this will have a huge impact, won't it, on the organisation as a whole.
And then, as we go through this framework, so what would be the hidden costs?
Yeah, the S is sickness and
Mm.
mistakes. So when we're exhausted, like we know ourselves, don't we? When we're tired, we make more mistakes, we can't
Mm.
speak, we can't focus.
Yes.
Has a huge knock on impact then on sickness leave or absentee from work. This is a really big thing. So it's going to impact the business, but also you've got a human there.
Hmm.
If we put the person first, like a human that's struggling, you know. So that's really important to think about, that we're making sure that we are protecting people and not contributing to illness or sickness.
Yeah, and it's a huge issue. I mean, again, it costs the economy a huge amount of money annually, in terms of sickness days lost. I mean, one stat that I find particularly useful as a sort of benchmark, when companies ask me, have I got a sickness issue problem? The average amount of sickness days lost in the UK is around 6 days. So typically, if an organisation's perhaps having more than that amount of time off for any individual, that's where I'd be suggesting there might be something more systemic going on. There might be an issue in terms of the things we've been speaking about today, really, in terms of what's driving the sickness absence. If it's under that, as you said earlier, we're not robots. People feel unwell. We're humans at the end of the day. We're fragile. And there's an aspect of understanding that comes with that, I think, from an employer's perspective, especially if it's a healthy environment and leadership understand and convey that there's a support mechanism for people and an understanding that people occasionally get unwell. But I think at the same time, from a financial point of view, a lot of what we've spoken about today, the way I think it should be framed is actually, or it could be framed rather, it's an investment. It's an investment in avoiding these situations and the cost of having people taking time off on a regular basis, or perhaps even the cost of attrition and people leaving the business. So yeah,
Yes.
it's not only about the psychology piece, it's actually about the pounds and pence pragmatism of looking after your people.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I guess this links on to the T, which
Mm,
is training and recruitment costs. So when people are stressed and burnt out, they're going to leave. That staff turnover is going to be really high. Think about kind of the hiring, onboarding, retraining costs. And actually, it's weighing that up, isn't it? It's about investing in people's well-being in the first place to support the resilience. All of that, as you were just saying, comes at a cost. And
mhm.
actually, probably a greater financial cost to the organisation than investing in somebody's well-being and well-being in the workplace in the first place.
I mean, are you finding the driver behind some of these reasons of, mind health, and is there any correlation there between challenges that the UK is facing around like cost of living, or I suppose, I mean, really, we're talking about the source of stress here. Is that something that you find in a pattern emerging where people are perhaps more minded about their financial situations, or have you noticed any increases around that in terms of the reasons behind people taking time off if they're unwell or if they need some kind of mind health support?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really great question. And I think there's so many different stressors that people can experience. Some
Mhm.
of them kind of can link to the stress that we can be under, in the home, as you were saying, like the cost of living, lots of other things around kind of our own health, what's
Mhm.
going on with family, what's going on with relatives, what's going on with kind of all parts of us. As we were saying before, we're not robots and we bring our whole self to work.
Mhm.
So there's so many different reasons that an individual could be experiencing stress and so many different stressors that we have to kind of juggle like spinning plates all the time. And if we
Mhm.
don't think about supporting people, it's only a matter of time till one of those plates drops, two of those plates drops, and then somebody burns out. So we want to be thinking about that proactive approach,
Mhm.
supporting people and helping them build their level of control over life stress. I always
Mhm.
say life lives, but it's about thinking about what can we control, where is our area of control, and supporting people to build that resilience.
Do you
Yeah.
find that there's a power in acceptance as well in these situations where it perhaps gives people a bit more perspective, shall we say, in terms of what they can and can't influence? Is that quite a healthy way of approaching these kind of challenges?
Yeah, makes me think about the areas of control. And there's like lovely models that people can look up online.
Mhm.
Often, when I'm with teams or with people, we'll draw it out. So, the inner circle is what can I actually control? These are things that are usually just to do with us, what I think, what I eat, what I do. And then everything else can be on the outer circle. What can't I control? Other people, what other people think, the economy, all the other things that we've been talking about. And it's really trying to accept, okay, all these things on that outer circle, I have to accept that I can't control them. And if we actually focus all of our attention, and if we focus our attention on that, that's not going to be helpful. in fact, that's going to lead to that unhelpful thinking, stress, and then burnout. So it's so much more healthy to think about, okay, I have to accept this is outside of my control and really kind of focus on what is within your control so you can feel empowered in
Right.
life and not disempowered.
Do you
Yeah.
think that helps build trust as well, where you can create an environment where people do feel comfortable in practicing that aspect? I think one of the challenges I find, especially from a HR perspective, is that companies view a policy, or actually the workforce as well, the people working there will view a policy as a sort of, they're going through the motions, it's just a piece of paper. The power in the policy really is the people it's trying to support. And what I mean by that is that with any policy, it's important that you practice what you preach. And I've visited companies before as part of a discovery session, and we've chatted through policy and we've looked at things like, do you have a wellbeing policy? And sometimes they may do, more often than not, they don't, which I think is, again, an indicator of where some organizations sit. But at the same time, what I always suggest is it's not only enough to have a policy, you've got to be able to practice what you preach. So hopefully the audience, the listeners can actually take some of these handy hints and tips and start implementing them in a way that's good for them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So making sure that you've got a wellbeing policy
Mhm.
and making sure that you are then using that wellbeing policy to support your staff. And then I would also add a third thing in there from my experience, which is where if leaders, managers, something's going on in the workplace, maybe something's happened or the loss of a family member of one of your employees or something's happened, which is life, right? Those things are going to happen. But often what may happen is that manager or leader hasn't gone back to the policy.
Right.
So they're kind of flapping, they don't know what to do. The first thing to always think about is, are you reading that policy? Have you started implementing those things? As simple as that step sounds, actually remembering that, there's power in that policy, it's there to support. So
Right.
taking those steps, supporting your staff member, and actually going back to what your organisation's put in place in the first place and using that to navigate what to do.
Well, it's been, again, a fantastic, really interesting conversation with you again today, Sarah. If people want to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for having me. I've loved our conversation. If you're listening and you want to start a conversation about your workplace wellbeing, you can get in touch by my website, sarahetoombs.com, or social media, LinkedIn or my Instagram. I'd love to connect.
Amazing. I'm sure, I'd encourage everybody to reach out if you require any form of psychotherapy support or workplace well-being, workplace health and mind health. Reach out and connect with Sarah. She'll be more than happy to guide you through step by step what your requirements are, what your needs are. I suppose from
Thank
my
you.
side, then, wrapping it up, folks, if anybody does need to get in touch or perhaps provide some answers to this, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, on Instagram. But a great way to get in touch, type in OESHR in your Google search engine. It'll take you straight through to the website where there's all manner of information on there about us and how to get in touch. So, in terms of wrapping it up, then, for the audience, I'd perhaps consider, when was the last time that your leadership team reviewed their own behaviors around boundaries and balance and those role modeling behaviors that we've spoken about today? And really leave it with this, that in my view, culture flows down. If the top person in the team, if they're burnt out, then the whole business feels it. So if anything that we've said today strikes a chord, keep in touch and we look forward to welcoming you again back on the next podcast for the HR Doctor, your people prescription, sharing a dose of people wisdom.